Heyo, everybody! Today, we're talking about what beats up what. Class archetypes, class counters, what classes can beat up what other classes, or, in the words of the developers and some of their write-ups and such, which ones have advantages and disadvantages. They're so theoretically working to instill a sense of balance into the game from the start. So even though beta's not out yet, we really want to look at it and see what we think is going to happen. Not just in beta, but preferably in the live game. We're looking at all the classes, no holds barred. Arthurians, as Strike has pointed out, automatically better than everybody.
Yes, of course.
Let's just get that out of the way. It's just a general rule.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Balance rule. Arthurians first. The rest doesn't really matter.
Just go ahead and give them a +10 to everything. And I mean everything. But to start this off, what we want to do is talk about specific classes. We've got kind of a structure to this one. We're going to look at specific class balances. What classes may have distinct advantages and disadvantages against others just in general. Then look at circumstances, because the circumstances you're in are really going to change things. Then maybe we will branch out to some other areas, talk about launch. Maybe are there things that seem to be missing? Are we in a good place going forward? So on and so forth. So, classes. Who wants to start us off for what can just stomp the crap or, just be a little bit better than other things?
Why don't you start us off with this one?
All right. I can. The first thing that really comes to mind for this, which will definitely be, I think, prominent in Beta 1 to some degree, is archers are, I won't say an effective counter necessarily, but definitely have some advantages against pretty much any squishy character. They've got very long range. They've got the DPS, theoretically, to take them out. So your mages and your healers, archers are going to be a pretty natural fit. When we're looking at Beta 1, especially, since what other options do we have? We've got healer, heavy fighter, and archer. It's probably, for beta testing, going to come down to the archers to really deal with the healers.
Especially early on, before mages get into the game.
There's no other long-range firepower. There's no stealthers in beta. I was looking at...
Yeah, if you look at Beta 1, definitely the archers are going to be the counters to healers. If only option, just really. If only because they don't have to get in range. So
at least for live, they'll have the camouflage. Obviously, won't have that for Beta 1, I don't think, but for live,
probably not.
Can have the camouflage, which will help with flanking, getting in behind to at least when you're not in keeps anyway, to get some kind of firepower on those squishier characters. Not like doesn't think archers are OP anymore. I hope not. I don't want anything to be OP. Just good.
Yeah.
Just good at what it does, which hopefully is killing mages.
There was whether I don't know if it was 19 or 24. I remember linking to you guys both Ben's dose of design in one of the newsletters.
19 is more oriented on the class balance. Yeah.
And they were talking about damage types, especially going in Beta 1, where archers deal a lot of physical damage, which makes them which is why they're, I guess, better at working against low armored classes, mages, health or healers, things like that, things that don't wear heavy armor, because heavy armor has a natural mitigation against physical attacks.
Yes. Now, I won't get into circumstances, but there are ways you can build your characters in different ways, of course, which we'll get into with different circumstances. One thing that's not really a circumstance, because that's part of the class that Mr. Peace gets into, is the Winter Shadow. I don't think they're really going to have short or medium range, even though because they are still an archer, and archers are kind of defined by having having like the longest range. I do think they will have a shorter range than the other archers.
They have
but
a
I think
short
they're
range
still going
compared
to
to
have
other archers.
Yeah, I think they're still going to have a longer range than healers per se. And so they'll still be hopefully effective in that. They'll just also be able to do it from not as long of a distance. And they're going to be a lot more mobile because of that.
But then, as Sakrik mentioned, is that one of the big disadvantage, and probably one of the way melee characters and heavy fighters more precisely can counter archers is the simple body blocking. The fact that arrows are physical objects. So with their armor mitigation, they can actually physically protect and counter a lot of the archer plays, because at the distance you're at, you have time to react to a projectile arriving. So
also, I think also in one of the same newsletters, they talked about how even though there's like tab targeting as well as free aim, it's not a guarantee you're going to hit anyone from such long range, even without blocking. Sporadic movement from a player has the capability of just completely avoiding an arrow.
Which I think one of the things there is you're really hoping, like especially with healers, that they're focused on healing people, not dodging your arrows. But heavy fighters can go stand and shield healers, and that's where we won't have for beta 1, but hopefully pretty soon you'll get in the mages, since magic is supposed to be generally stronger against armor. The armor doesn't really have as much damage mitigation against magic damage. So the mages kind of work as an effective counter against the front lines of heavy armor people, who then are reliant on the healers to keep them up against the magic damage, while you've got hopefully archers somehow getting in the damage on those healers.
Yeah, I think that's why archers seem to be best suited for mages, because at the moment mages lack mobility for the most part.
Yes.
They're not all glass cannons, but they're definitely mostly classes that require to stay in a place.
They require setup,
cast long preparation spells to do a lot of damage, which is why they're also said that if you don't leave them alone, or if you do leave them alone,
you're gonna regret it.
You're gonna regret it.
Yeah.
So.
But I especially think, more so than the healers, I really think archers are the anti-mage eventually, because they've got more mobility, they've got the stealth ability, and then they've got the DPS against clothies. So unless you're walking around with a mage in heavy armor, being rooted in trying to cast long range spells and everything, archers can really get in and eat them alive. Which I think may be the point. You've got the mages taking out heavy fighters. Meanwhile, the archers are trying to protect the fighters and the healers against the mages, or even circling around to try to get at the enemy mages and healers. I do agree, Sacrix. I would like to know what the deflection and passive ratings and stuff are on active and passive deflection. That's really going to determine a lot, but...
Yeah, but sadly we don't have that kind of stats. I do think, however, even if we don't have those precise numbers, the way they have presented the classes gives you a good idea of what can counter what in the philosophy of the classes and of the idea of the class, even before implementation.
Now, I had one crazy idea I wanted to mention and see what y'all thought about it. I was trying to think, what... in melee range, when you're really getting into a fight, a keep fight, or even the core groups coming into melee combat in a field, what counters a heavy fighter? What stops a heavy fighter from just rolling through everybody?
It's going to be
another heavy fighter
to say. Heavy fighters could do it, but I think largely the devout classes are going to, with their magic damage, in mid to close range, are going to hopefully have a decent chance at getting through some of that armor.
I actually have a different recommendation, which is why I said it was kind of wonky and left field a little bit.
Yeah, a couple different.
Support. The reason I say that is because I started going through all the support classes, and one thing I noticed some of the abilities. Well, I have my notes here because I noticed some of the abilities some of the support classes have. Chant of War increases physical damage somebody takes. Explosive shout purges physical buffs. These are from different support classes.
Yeah.
Deceptive siphon drains health directly. Melody of Malady decreases resistance to poison and disease effects. And so I'm not really saying support by themselves, but like if an enemy has a fair number of heavy fighters, I started looking at this going, you know, these support classes all have some pretty decent looking AoE debuffs that look like they may be specifically geared towards weakening the heavy fighters.
Yeah, and
I think it's a universal weakness, especially when you're talking about blood, which is something that everyone uses.
Well, I said drains health, not blood.
Yes.
Oh, I thought you said blood. But
and yeah, I mean these are all universal. So. These are all universal, but like increasing physical damage. Who's going to be taking the most physical damage? The heavy fighter. Decreasing physical buffs. Who probably has the physical buffs? I'm assuming the heavy fighters.
I think in the long haul, archers are actually going to be a good counter because they're more mobile than the mages. And with those debuffs, and even without, they have more chances of stopping a heavy fighter that is charging than a mage that requires quite a bit of setup. By the time the mage is set up, the heavy fighter should have the time to close the gap between him and the fighter and the mage, and prevent them, if only from casting and doing any damage. Yeah. While the archers have more chances of striking and moving away.
I think the archers are more circumstantial. Definitely something.
It's going to be dependent on whether they can penetrate the armor as well.
Yes.
I'm seeing a lot of comments about collision, snaring. I do think the heavy fighters are definitely the most. I mean, they're tanks, so everyone is, of course, focusing on them. That's kind of the goal. Yeah. I was just trying to think of who poses not necessarily the best one-on-one, but who poses possibly the greatest problem for them in their strong spot, in the melee combat, in the middle of the fray, and the support kind of popped out to me as looking like they definitely have some debuffs that may be more geared towards that melee combat and diminishing their natural advantages.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking at magic damage as being where that happens, whether it's the devout or possibly the spirit mages, who have a huge versatility in all three realms. They have the ability to penetrate, be in front of lines or behind lines. 2 of the 3 classes do magic damage right off the bat. I think the Morgan does largely physical damage with her spirits bashing into your head. But they have such a high degree of versatility in being able to change their situation that they can move around, deal with the closeness of a heavy fighter, as well as pull back if they need to, and still be just as effective.
I actually had a slightly different view on this where it comes to magic. I mean, I think one of the developer discussions, one of the newsletters did talk about magic being strong against their armor.
Yes.
But I actually had a slightly different view on that. Like I was thinking the mages would be good at long range, but when it really gets to the fight, it really feels almost to me like heavy fighters could be a large number of heavy fighters could be the answer to too much of a lot of different things. Like if somebody comes out with too many spirit mages, heavy fighters coming out in force could really seem like they could really crush the weaker characters. Same thing with archers, because they've got the heavy damage mitigation from the armor. They can possibly absorb enough hits with heals that they can get to the archers and deal with them. Too many support. But what I saw as a possibility for if someone has too many heavy fighters, they're becoming too reliant on that, was not only the mages, because again, magic damage, and the devout kind of fall in that same category of just pumping out magic damage to stop them, but perhaps also the shapeshifters, because going through the shapeshifters, I noticed there was a lot of piercing and magic damage on both of those.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a faster DPS melee character with piercing and magic damage, which seems to me like would definitely work well against the heavy fighters.
What I like also is what Ben said. I think it was in the newsletter 19, that they are not trying to balance the classes and their counters as a apple versus apple way, like most games do, because you need to do it for PvE. But as they said in their foundation principles, the rock paper scissors way. So for me, a lot of the counters, there's no absolute counters to each class, but there's a situational one. Depending on the situation, different classes will counter each class depending on the setup of the fight.
Yeah, and especially when, as Zager is noting, and some people are talking about the lack of hard CC in the game,
Yes.
or lack of emphasis on it, focusing on soft crowd control, is definitely going to increase the importance of melee people, because hard CC just ruins melee in PvP.
Yeah,
and I think that's where the group efforts are definitely being emphasized, where you can look at these as 1v1 situations and come up with some interesting counters, but largely someone's going to be doing something that someone else needs to take advantage of. So if you're talking about CC, in the case of the Forest Stalker, the TDD Archer, who has a plethora of plant-based movement snares, slowing down heavy fighters, and then someone else who has a specialization against heavy armor utilizing that slow to their advantage and trying to really do as much damage as they can before those slows wear off.
Absolutely. I did have kind of a little game I wanted to play, but before that, I wanted to see, were there any specific classes that either of you wanted to mention that we haven't already talked about? And as always, every question's open to chat. So
we haven't really talked about stealth. They're talking about it in chat a bit, but like, where do they come in? How do they fit in? Where are they? Where do they seem best suited? Because I've seen on the forums, I've mentioned before that I find them as being a great counter to squishies as well. Typically in MMOs, they are. But I've also mentioned they probably seem to be one of the best ways to deal with archers.
Still a squishy class.
Still a slightly squishy class, but they can get further back without being seen. And they represent an element of surprise that is going to be up in an archer's face, causing them to have to move around and not do any DPS.
That was actually a conclusion I kind of came to, was that, I've been worried about healers, and I do think that stealthers are pretty important to helping shut down healers, because as they've said, if you ignore healers, they're really, really ridiculously powerful, so you've got to shut them down. How do you shut them down without stealthers? That kind of leaves it reliant on the archers. And one thing I'd kind of considered is that, archers are perhaps one of the only other really effective groups against mages and healers. So but stealthers would also be really good against archers. So until we have stealthers, or perhaps shapeshifters, or something that's fast, mobile, and does that good close range damage, archers may be a little bit OP, because what else can get over? This is actually was something in my circumstantial section, but we'll go ahead and talk about it now. What else can get to the archers and kill them and stop them from murdering everybody?
Archers,
with the launch classes.
Other archers,
other archers, mages or other archers. Or enough
crafters with player siege.
Yes, definitely, because I fully expect in the range of siege engines that are going to be accessible, some of them being anti-personal engines rather than just anti-buildings.
And that may be, since we know that stealthers are not likely to be in at launch, that may be the case, that perhaps they add some long-range anti-personal siege weapons to help deal with the archer problem. Because otherwise I could see it potentially being an issue. I mean, if archers are the only counter to archers, it actually leads to another question in the sort of game I wanted to have. What I was thinking of is some sample scenarios. What if this is on the field? What classes do we have to deal with it? And one of those was, what do we do to deal with stealthers when they're in the game? You counter them only with other stealthers? I mean, what deals with stealthers when they're in?
Actually, and this is kind of where I don't disagree with Sacrix, but I do love the scouts, and I think the scouts actually play the role of the anti-stealth with their marking.
Yeah,
I think it's possible.
I think they help. They're not the end result to doing it, but I think that they exist as a part of that system to be able to assist with keeping scouts
not in
visible.
killing. Yeah, scouts would be helping in keeping stealthers in check, not killing them, but making them visible and targetable when they're in stealth mode.
I do think that's possible. And I think there are some other things like, if you have heavy fighters hanging back guarding the squishies, obviously when a stealther pops out, he can deal with it. He can deal with the stealth person pretty easily. That shouldn't be a problem. Also, shapeshifters I think could be, with their mobility, maybe not for the Arthurians, but for the other two realms, the mobility that seems to be inherent in their shapeshifters could make them able to get back and catch up to the stealthers and deal with them.
Mm-hmm.
If stealth in this game works anything like other MMOs, which it may not, typically a stealth class, upon taking damage, is removed from stealth. Therefore, bleed-based classes bleed damage.
Dot-based,
which leads me to the Enchanted Knight or shapeshifters in general do some bleed damage across the board.
Yeah, I just don't think. I think since it's for stealthers, they go into a completely different place. They go into the Veil.
Yes.
I'm assuming most classes won't be able to hit them while they're in the Veil, except for other stealthers who are in the Veil, and maybe something like scouts that can mark them.
The thing is, they did say that getting into the Veil is going to take a while to the stealthers. So you can't just like
once
most
you come out, you're out.
Yeah, like most assassin in MMOs, you can't just get out of stealth, hit somebody, and get back in stealth and get away.
And I know one of them might be the red cap. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. Has the ability to bring people who are currently in the Veil with them out of it. So I think there's definitely going to possibly even be some Veil combat between stealthers. So stealthers could be their own potential.
But
counter.
again, like with archers, if your archers are countering archers,
right?
Stealthers are countering stealthers. That's kind of an issue. I feel could have other people, which I think we do. They could possibly do something with the scouts. Obviously, heavy fighters. I don't think stealthers had any abilities that looked like they were going to be especially good against heavy fighters, because most people 1-on-1 with a heavy fighter shouldn't be doing very well. That's kind of their point.
But going along with stealth, your question was, how do you counteract them? My question for them would be, what do you do without them in the game or even present when they represent the unknown in a scenario? Because without stealthers, you can see a group and know exactly what their composition is. You can plan for it entirely, and there's no stealthers. You don't have to worry about people popping up. But when they're in the game, you start to ask, do they have stealthers? You don't know. You can't see them. What if they have like 5 of them? And that represents just this unknown strategy and use of tactics and trying to figure out what to do. They add a huge element of change and variable to any kind of play.
And at least if the scout, that does add direct combat application for scouts as well. If the scouts can locate and identify them, even if they can't do much to them, but can at least perhaps identify them in the Veil and go, there are X amount of scouts, X amount of stealthers here
in this area.
That's information that you need. And as Sacrix did point out, there is of course the original talk of having Veil Walkers versus Veil Stalkers, 2 different groups of stealthers. That one is perhaps more anti-stealther, whereas the other one is more anti people in the actual combat.
Well, the counter to Mr. Peace is saying that about the counter to group of stealthers. They haven't talked about specific counters to group of stealthers, but they did say that for most stealthers, I think for most stealthers, I know that at least for the Arthurian ones, the longer they stay in the Veil, the weaker they will be when they come out. So there is a you can't stay in the Veil and stealth for an extended period of time. It is a method of attack or retreat but it's not something you can't go from the safe city to the front lines in stealth mode without risking any attack. That's not how it works.
And Sacrix, we've been around this wheel numerous times. You're going to keep saying scouts are useless, and we're going to keep saying that they're not, and we're both going to give reasons, and neither one of us are going to agree with the other. So I'm not going to debate scouts. We've been here. I do think another one of these scenarios I wanted to mention is, because I did have a couple of these, just kind of thought experiments for what could possibly happen in battles, is... I can read my own handwriting. Holy crap! What is that word? What are you? The Blessed Crow. What if the enemies close in melee range? They have a number of these devout Blessed Crow who, when looking at their abilities, they seem to have tons of AOE effects and damage abilities and such that look like they would just be horrible to fight in a melee fight.
Well, the thing about them, if I remember, I think I made a little bit of a rant about them several episodes ago about how they require dead bodies to do a lot of their ability.
That is true.
In a slow-paced game, if people aren't dying, how are they going to be as effective?
Yeah.
So... they definitely do a lot of AoE, and if there are a lot of dead bodies, I think they can pose some threats, especially since they have the ability to move their cauldrons around. But if people aren't dying, I don't even see them having a big place in a group.
They might have a place in a siege group, siege battles, big battles, but not in roaming groups. Because they lack the mobility to move around and be effective while moving around.
Yeah, I have to say, again, one thing we have to bear in mind is that the abilities on the website are just a sample. So I don't think that necessarily all of their abilities are going to use corpses.
No.
By any
They'll
means.
have magic damage, like straight, just to cast a spell at you.
Yeah, I think some of their bigger spells are going to require dead bodies and such.
But
just looking at their spells in general, a lot of them are these AoE things focused on their cauldrons, and they have all these things that drop out. I did think that perhaps shapeshifters again come into play here. And shapeshifters come into play in a lot of my notes as possible counters, specifically because they seem like they have the mobility and the versatility, as well as a higher level of toughness than some of these squishy characters. So perhaps they can do effective damage to some of these squishier characters and really get in, as well as just perhaps having lots of heals to deal with the AoE, which I hate saying this, the class counters itself, but Devout being able to supplement the melee with heals may not be a counter, but perhaps having sufficient Devout there as well as healers will be enough, or even just primary healers maybe as a decent counter to Blessed Crow damage. I'm not sure.
I mean, I find that you know, your Trinity, your healers, your mages, and your heavy fighters all do something very well, but they only do that one something very well.
Yeah.
And then you enter into the hybrid world with shapeshifters, spirit mages, and the Devout, and they really start to add diversity to the group, and that's what makes the group better. And I think all of the hybrid classes are going to be probably more critical even than the Trinity classes, which I think is partially perhaps, and Sacrix can yell at me if I'm wrong, why he wants them in so heavily at launch.
They're much more versatile than other classes. Yeah, Sacrix, he wants the shifters in as ASAP.
Not my priority. I want them in, but definitely not my priority.
Well, we know they're definitely not going to be.
He just wants them in because he wants to play one. That's all.
But yeah, they have more versatility, but they're still dependent on a lot of other classes, and they're still susceptible to hard counters from more specialized classes, because the fact their versatility means that, at least in my opinion, then they're not as proficient in each area. They're not as effective in their heavy fighter style form than a heavy fighter. They're not as effective as a say a DPS in the DPS form. So they still, like an archer can easily counter, because they don't have the damage mitigation that the heavy fighter would have. An archer in melee form can counter the shapeshifter in melee form, for example.
I really feel like the shapeshifter, like, and this is why they come up in my notes a lot. I feel like the shapeshifter by themselves, not great. Because again, they don't specialize. They bounce around a lot. They shift into different roles. But I feel like they're probably going to be able to address imbalances in the other team. Like if the other team is showing up with too much of this, too many mages to try to deal with some of the classes on the other end, the shapeshifters can rush in, get to those mages perhaps around the line or something, and help to deal with them and put them down. Where same thing with dealing with archers. If the archers aren't just there trying to kill shapeshifters, they're trying to deal with the enemy mages, then shapeshifters can perhaps get up to that point when we don't have stealthers yet, or well, I guess when we have shapeshifters, we have stealthers. But if there aren't an excess of stealthers around, then perhaps they can make that distance to close in with the archers. I do tend to agree with Sacrix that just having the heavy fighter as a melee at launch is kind of an issue.
Yes.
This was something that I will admit annoyed me in the not the last wrap up, but the wrap up before that. Someone had asked about, I think it was Sacrix, had asked about only having one melee at launch, and MJ had kind of gone, "Do we only have one melee?" And I was like, "Yeah. Why are you pretending? Yes, there's only one melee class. What?
Yeah.
Don't pretend. There's just one."
The devout are planned for launch. They're pseudo melee at least, but it's still magic.
They've said that
damage.
it's a magic damage class. It's not a melee class. They just have
it's
melee weapons.
Not a physical damage class.
They have ranged magic abilities. They said that during the class reveal that they're going to be a magic damage class. So
when you're looking at beta 1 and launch, end of beta 1 launch, you have, I think, just teams, unless you're looking at a much larger strategy with larger groups, you're looking at teams just kind of clashing and just beating each other up. Whereas having the hybrid classes allow one team to counter in the midst of battle and being able to push or pull back. And that really gives the element of making it less of a headbutting and more thinking.
I'd say, Zadrid, you can make that argument that yes, the bards have a melee attack, but
they're not melee characters.
The Viking Archer has a melee attack. Does that make it a melee class? No. It's not primarily focused on doing melee damage. It's not a melee class.
If your supports are doing melee damage, they're doing something wrong.
Hitting someone with your loot on occasion does not make you a melee class.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I will say that I think the heavy fighters are being designed to be effective enough that I don't think it's going to ruin the game if they're the only melee class at launch. I think it's just going to put a lot of pressure on them.
Yeah.
And you're going to have a lot of
them. Well, they're definitely going to shine. They're going to be weaker in the sense that they're going to need help from the front lines, but they're just going to be weaker. The mages are in. You're not going to, archers are going to struggle.
And I have to say, Zadrid, as I mentioned earlier, I think the scouts will have the supports will have some important roles in melee. I think a lot of their abilities lend themselves to helping to deal with other melee classes, like the heavy fighter. Unfortunately, I don't know that that's necessarily the type of melee damage that we're lacking. We're really lacking the mobile melee abilities to get out and get behind the lines, to get out to the outliers like the archers and deal with them. I don't think we're going to want scouts running up the hill by themselves going, run faster, with a loot up in the air coming after the archers, because they're going to die halfway up.
No. And
keeps talking about magic, so much magic. Do you guys think that there's going to be a natural counter with Veilstorms? Will they be frequent enough to be considered a natural counter to the heavy magic?
So. No, I don't think so. I think that it'll be a thing that happens on occasion in really big battles.
Yeah.
But I don't think
Yeah,
it's
not
going to
in
be
skirmishes.
frequent enough to happen against magic. Again, I think this is where the archer is perhaps OP. Until we get stealthers or shapeshifters into the game, I think archers are pretty much going to be it for shutting down mages.
Yeah.
Obviously, if a heavy fighter gets in close range with a mage, they can kill them. But if a team has any kind of group composition, the heavy fighter should not be getting in close range with the mages. So that leaves it to the archers to deal with it.
Yeah. And even if you look at the final lineup of the classes, there's only 2 melee classes in the final lineup of the classes we know. Purely melee damage. You have the heavy fighters and the stealthers. That's it. The shapeshifters are hybrids, so they're not purely damage. So they're not purely melee. But purely melee, you only have 2.
But they are basically melee range from the looks of it. They do
and I agree.
I don't consider magic damage to not necessarily be melee damage, because I don't care if someone has magic fists and they're punching something; it's still melee damage.
We're talking about physical, like an actual damage type, physical damage versus magic damage.
I just mean someone walking into melee range and doing something that causes damage to the other person, and is tougher than a mage, because I think that's important for being a melee character. They have to be able to take a hit. If they can't take a couple of hits without dying, like a mage, then you don't want Clothy running up.
That's the shapeshifter.
We're not talking Strike and Arbacus. We're not talking about classes that can do melee damage as a secondary ability, or classes that do physical damage. We talk about melee range, the length of your arm. That's melee range. And class specialized in doing melee combat and melee damage, there's only 2.
Yeah, for me, I mean, I could be wrong, but I don't think the shapeshifters are going to be really squishy. I think they're going to be a little bit tougher than the stealthers will be.
They come off as being very...
Because I think they have to be. Otherwise, there's no way they work.
I don't see them as wearing heavy armor.
No.
Although the Enchanted Knight sometimes gives me that feel when you look at their pictures. They're just giant, beefy scales.
I think he might be heavy armor, yeah.
But I think they're going to be versatile enough that they actually have quite a range of health and armor and the ability to regen that.
I really picture the Viking and the TDD shapeshifters as kind of like Fury Warrior type things. They're melee DPS that's pretty tough. Not super tough, but pretty tough. Whereas it's basically a brawler type character that can switch around and specialize in different things, of course. Not saying the combat style is the same, but the role, it's basically more of a bruiser role a little bit. They're fast. They do a lot of damage. They don't immediately die. Whereas I think the Arthurian shapeshifter is probably going to be more like an off tank. They're not nearly as tanky as the heavy. They're not as tanky as the heavy fighter, but they're probably going to be slower and tougher than the other shapeshifters.
And they're going to be tankier than the other shapeshifters.
And they're the only one that really has long range magical damage too.
Well, I mean, the Enchanted Knight does heavy slashing and like bleed rending type damage. They're close range. They have a long range.
But they also have like I think it's the demon form that has long range magical attacks.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we're super diving into shapeshifters now, which I don't want to do so much. I did want to
47 shapeshifter counters.
I did want to get into circumstantial stuff if we can.
Yes.
Specifically, I wanted to talk about 2 things: specializations and then distance of combat. So, in specializations, obviously, you can now, with rehabilitation, you can customize your own abilities with different nodes, different things that they can specialize in. Archers can specialize in armor penetration with abilities to try to deal with heavy fighters better.
Conversely, heavy fighters can specialize in piercing damage mitigation to counteract armor penetration.
Exactly. Gear, I think, counts in specialization too. You can decide I want a piercing weapon, or you can decide I want armor that's enchanted against magic and help me deal with mages because heavy fighters getting eaten alive by fire attacks. Shield wall for the win. Let's see.
Well, it's not just does one class do melee, therefore you don't need others. There's so many other small variables with damage types and the air system, which isn't in yet. But there are so many things to think about with damage types and the surplus of damage types that just because you're melee doesn't mean another melee class becomes useless.
And I would say, Mr. East, I don't think Mage and Spirit Mage are doing the same thing. They're both doing ranged magic damage. So yes, in a way they are doing the same thing, but they're doing them very differently. And I think that really varies up what they're working to counter against. You know, mages are doing the long range damage thing. Somehow can do closer range damage, perhaps. The spirit mages, I think, are very much a medium range intended sort of magic
medium and short range.
Some of them do physical damage. The Morgan does physical damage. The Arthurian spirit mage can switch between tank, melee DPS, range DPS, magic DPS. So they're just versatile. Is where they're different.
But I guess what I wanted to ask for circumstances of specialization are what are some weaknesses that might be countered by builds? That might be you know, a whole group of people could work on something with their specializations to compensate for their personal weakness.
I can see perhaps people specializing in panic as a weakness to something, a general kind of universal specialization. I can't think of anything specific as to why you would want to specialize in panic to counter one thing, but a heavy use of panic or team build used with heavy panic could offer some very interesting playstyles as people start to get frightened.
Against heavy fighters. Going against Arthurians, the Arthurians in your realm are pumping out tons of heavy fighters. Panic might, you know, help prevail in those melee fights.
The soft TC, the snare, the speed debuffs that a lot of TDDs have, specializing a team on that to counter for heavy fighters again, or any type of short range.
As Sacrix mentioned, the Vout and the Shapeshifters both had, depending on the class, some panic abilities that they could really pump out. So do
TDD,
the Scouts.
I think, as a whole, had
the Scouts.
The Scouts. The TDD in large had, I think, heavy use of panic. So we can see, I think, a lot of TDD comps that might specialize there.
Definitely varies by realm. The Arthurians don't have a whole lot of panic, whereas the TDD have a lot, and the
but the Arthurians have a lot of disruption.
Have a little bit, yes.
I think heavy fighters have we've talked about this, have the specialization to becoming more true tank. They're not designed to have started as a tank. They're quasi tank, if you will, pseudo tank. But I think with armor and resistances and mitigation, they could become a tank, or they could go the route of full just brute force DPS. And then with both of those different specializations within each.
You know, I think that's one of the things with the heavy fighter on like the melee issue, not having a lot of real focused melee classes. The heavy fighter, depending on spec, can either spec heavy armor, or they could even go into something with kind of a medium or lighter armor and focus on DPS, and it basically becomes a bruiser character at that point. It just depends on the versatility of the abilities, which we've seen is pretty wide. As long as they've got some gap closers, there's no reason you can't make a group of heavy fighters that are faster and more DPS focused. I think one of the easiest specializations to kind of point out is healers with heavy armor. For dealing with, if archers are a problem, you can roll out the heavy armor healers and you know, start to mitigate some of that problem.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Doesn't heavy armor cause some sort of preparation delay?
Oh, I'm sure.
Consuming...
Yes, probably. Yes,
I think that's the case with any of these specializations.
It will probably also depend on the banes and boons that
that's true too.
Each character takes.
Yeah, you can do something to counter a problem that your class has, but it's always going to come with a sacrifice. If you're focusing with heavy fighter, if you want to go more bruiser and be a DPS character, you can do that, but you're going to die faster.
Yeah, if you look at the Arthurian heavy fighter, they excel by staying alive. The more damage they take, the more damage they do. So they actually kind of almost ask you to be a little bit of a tank, take some damage in order to buff yourself up and deal damage based off of your total mitigation. So
I'll throw some scouts in groups just to annoy. And because I think they're useful.
I'm gonna roll a scout and just follow you around and mark things for you.
Just to remind you I'm being useful right now.
And yeah, Sacrix entirely right. All speculation. This is just design concepts.
As we said that in the intro, this is our speculation on what info we have right now,
which is not much, and it's all real old.
And we want it. Mark with the bot. Mark bot. Give us info if you're still here.
Seriously, we need topic ideas.
Yeah.
Anyway, one thing I did want to ask is launch. And this is, chat's been, I think, on this topic on and off the entire time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are we sufficient for launch? Is there something that's really missing from what's slated to come out for launch now? Or are we really probably pretty okay with what we've got lined up?
I think Sacrix has a lot of merit to his complaints. I will say I disagree with him on one thing, and mostly because I was thinking about it today, and I brought it up earlier with stealthers representing a huge unknown. Thinking about from the design point of view and what MJ and Ben and all of them are thinking about, not knowing if stealthers exist in the game. You know, if they're not in the game, you know what's going on. You can plan exactly accordingly. Nothing really changes in that aspect. So if they don't make it into the game, you can still have a game and plan perfectly fine. Once they're in the game, it adds fun variable, but I don't think that changes things too much. Whereas the hybrid classes, I full on agree with Sacrix. I think they need to be in at launch. Like, it really just needs to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think the game would be a lot better with stuff at launch. That's kind of my actually, I want scouts. Let me rephrase that. If I could have any class in at launch that's not slated for launch, it would be scouts, and Sacrix would throw a fit. But
probably
stealthers would be seconds. Shapeshifters are way off. I don't care. I think shapeshifters are really cool, but game balance wise, I really don't care that much about them. I don't think they're essential. I think they're just nice to have. I think stealthers could add a lot more surety to countering things and balancing things between like archers and healers. Which I think is potentially my biggest issue for launch is, how are things going to shape up with the archers and the healers? Are healers going to be unstoppable because no one can get back there to kill them? Are archers going to be too big of a problem because no one can get way out in the field to kill them?
Overall, the more classes we have going into launch, I think the better the game is going to be.
And
I think they'll be able to balance it. I think there'll be some issues with the fact that classes aren't coming out all at once, which we can get into I guess after this. But
balance is going to be an ongoing thing. But I would prefer a slightly unbalanced game with all the classes in at launch, rather than mostly perfectly balanced game with only some of the classes in at launch. When the meta has been set, and I know I posted that on the forum, and I know some people disagree with me, but the way the progression is being set up right now for CU, just stopping developing your character and picking up a new class, you're going to be behind on the curve, and you cannot catch up.
And this
you will not be able to catch up on the people who have been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 months. We don't even know when they're planning on releasing the other classes. If somebody has been playing their class 5 months more than you have, you will not catch up until they reach the soft cap, which is going to be a long while.
Yeah, it seems to be a very heavily time-based horizontal progression system. It's not going to be like, I just played for 3 weeks, so I'm soft capped. it's going to be 3 months and I'm maybe halfway to soft capped. So going from that transition to, well, I wanted to play the shapeshifter, but he's not in yet, so I guess I'll just play an archer for now. Making that change, those people are going to be kind of gimped in the shorter term of things. Once more time comes out, it'll start to balance out again. But
Yeah.
I do feel I do agree with that to a certain extent. I do if they just released it and you had to suck it up and just level the class, I'd be okay with it. I do feel like I would prefer that they had some sort of incentive towards leveling the newer classes. Like either you could sacrifice an existing character to get bonus development towards a new class, or maybe even like if you've got characters that you've been subscribed for X length of time, and now they come out with a new class, you can get bonus to development for that class for a certain length of time or something, in case you want to re-roll a character or something. Some way for them to accelerate the process, not necessarily put them at top tier immediately, but just to make it easier to get caught up with their existing characters. I think something like that could be nice for helping out, especially if stealthers don't make it in the game, because there are going to be people that want to play the game and they want to play a scout or a stealther or something else, and they know those classes are coming, but they're not in the game at launch, and so they're basically just playing something else, waiting for shapeshifters or something to come in, knowing they're going to switch, and then it comes out and they then just basically have to redo everything all over again. So I would like there to be something for them. I think that would be better than not having anything. I don't think it's absolutely essential to have.
There was in Sacrix's discussion on the forums about this. I think there was a comment from someone about them thinking maybe Mark will provide basically free respecs, getting rid of your class to respec into another one. Do you guys think that will be a thing?
Technically possible? Is it technically possible? I don't know. I'm not a tech guy.
Technically, yeah, anything's possible. You have to code it. Is it design-wise feasible to do that? To just switch from a class that you've had to unfortunately pick just because yours wasn't available, to then just the next day just getting rid of it, altering, switching to one of the new classes that comes out?
Let's see. So this will probably we've kind of discussed some of these already, but the last thing I really had was wanting to discuss what we see as the biggest problem with the current system, what we're looking at present, what might be the biggest issue or complication that comes up for it.
For me, it's the same as a lot of MMOs I've played over the years. It looks like the predominance of ranged characters.
It's a big thing. In most MMOs, range takes the cake.
Yeah,
that's really the case with most MMOs.
And I think that actually falls in line with why I think that at a certain point, numbers in a group fight start to outweigh strategy and start to outweigh class. Because if you were to say have a group of 40 people versus 40 people, maybe half of your group are archers or just a combination of archers and mages who are all focused, coordinated, solo targeting a person. How quick will that person die? For one.
Yeah.
And how effective can a melee class be going into a large group when they are so outnumbered from range to melee? How effective can they be against being in the midst of a large number of people who then focus fire kind of just the few frontline people who exist in the game? At what point do those numbers start to mean more than the strategy of the class energies and what's going on?
Well, strategy, when you're in a big battle like that, strategy has an importance, but it becomes a macro strategy, not a micro one. So
and I think that's... Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that's one thing to keep in mind also with this. We're talking about classes countering other classes, but this game, by and large, isn't being balanced by one-on-one fights.
No.
It's RVR. I mean, it's really... And that's why I've tried to frame some of these as more what if this group has a lot of heavy fighters instead of what kills a heavy fighter one-on-one, because you shouldn't have a heavy fighter fighting anybody one-on-one in a normal fight. I mean, there should always be someone else either healing or shooting in or stuff. So it really becomes a matter of group compositions against each other.
Yeah. And we'll see 1v1s. We'll see 8v8s, which is current group size. We'll see a mix of just random numbers in between that and say where they're aiming for 500 plus versus 500 plus versus 500 plus with all three realms converging. How much does class synergy start to matter at that point when you have so many people?
That's where I don't agree in the 1v1. There will be a 1v1s in the midst of the 8v8s or more. So the fact that classes are not balanced equally doesn't matter, because you're going to be in a 1v1 battle, but while you're fighting the guy that is in front of you, his buddy might be shooting arrows in your back, or your healer is going to heal you while you're taking damage. So it's never going to be a 1v1 unless you're a purely solo player, which I don't know why this game interests you if you are.
Or
even if you're MJ, but that's not But if you're a solo player, you refuse to group or refuse to fight in big battles. I don't know why you're interested in that game, but if you do, you're gonna get face rolled because you're never gonna be on a 1v1. So you accept that 90% of your fights are gonna be losses.
Yeah,
I do.
My concern. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No,
I already said.
I don't have.
You're good. I'm just reinforcing the range thing. it's in every MMO so far that I've been in. It's been the range has always been the king. And I was thinking about it today, and just a funny, I guess, quote off of Jurassic Park is CSE is so busy worrying about if they could make a game that can house 2,000 players effectively, and we're so obsessed by that they didn't stop to think they should.
Yeah, I mean, it really does. I mean, you look at it. World of Warcraft. How many melee classes do they have? Not many. They've added more since the game launched, but when you look at launch of the game, how many melee classes were there? Not really that many comparatively. You look at Star Wars: The Old Republic. They had a lot of melee range classes because there's Jedi. And even some of the Jedi were ranged essentially, so they still have more range than melee classes. Any MMO you really want to look at, it's pretty much the case. There's more range classes than the melee classes. The people still play the melee classes. I think in a game like this, it is perhaps more important that we have a good balance between melee and range. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there shouldn't be more range. I do think that one primary melee focus is perhaps not sufficient in the long run. And I do want to say about the solo thing, I'm definitely not in the boat that there is no place at all for solo play, and that you'll absolutely never have like a one-on-one fight with somebody. But when you're looking at
if you go farming crafters, sure.
If you're looking at the main focus of the game, most of the time, on these large scale battlefields and stuff, you're not going to have a one-on-one fight with somebody. You're not going to get in the middle of a big melee and have just one guy point at you and go, "You and me," and you're going to walk out and start sword fighting. That's going to happen only if other people aren't paying attention. Because even if I'm not in your group and I'm playing a archer and I see you over there fighting some guy, and that guy offends me, I'm going to shoot arrows into him. I'm not going to just let you die. I'm going to be like, no, I want him. That's my Arthurian guy.
It's a fight. It's a fight of honor. Yeah, screw that.
To add to that, I think Zermis was talking about the solo play. We're not saying that solo play is 1v, or that people who don't like to group up with guilds or join guilds don't have a place. I know Mark, MJ specifically, is a solo player, and he means that by he just doesn't guild himself. He goes out with the group. He fights with groups. He just doesn't join a guild. He likes to just be by himself and be able to choose what he wants to do when he wants to do it. We're talking here about just, you happen to be running maybe by yourself to catch up to a group further on ahead. You happen to run across another guy who might be trying to do the same, and a fight engages 1v1 right there.
Yeah, solo guy can follow behind my group and help us stab people. I don't care.
Yeah, but
if he's running in a big melee and we're all meleeing here, and he's running off this way and
by
runs to a group of 10
solo
people,
is somebody who doesn't want to play in a group or to join a group and wants to roam solo anywhere and not group with anybody, which is the case in most MMO nowadays because it's easy to do that. But in CU, if you just want to go out and try to kill people solo, without joining, without coordinating with a group, without even just following a group, you're going to get face rolled because you're not going to encounter a lot of people that are doing the same.
I'm going to go ahead and extend, to counter some of the message in chat, I'm going to go ahead and just extend an open welcome. If you're solo and new in the game, I'm not saying I want you to stand in front of my people, but if you want a group to follow around who will help you out, I have no problem with you following us around and helping us kill people. That's fine. My group is going to be focused on what we're doing. If you want to tag along, okay, sure. Just make sure you don't wander off. And if you wander off, we're not going to save you. We're taking the keep. That's what we're doing. You're wandered off.
Yeah.
You're lost now.
You're welcome to follow us, but
Pugs got to have use to. They got to help the realm.
Yeah.
You
need cannon fodder.
My only issue with the system, and this really isn't an issue, it's like a semi-issue, because it's a problem, but I don't really think it's a problem in the long term, more of a short-term problem. And that is, you never know what the other side is going to bring. Archers, that's a problem with rock, paper, scissors, I see. Archers are maybe really good at killing X, but if the enemy team shows up with none of that, you don't know that. Unless you have scouts who are actively scouting them, but otherwise, you don't really know what they're going to come to the battlefield with. Yeah. And even if you do have scouts, are you going to necessarily have someone who happens to have the other class and can switch out? That's a tough thing to do in this sort of game, I think. Mm-hmm. I do believe that's not a problem long term, because over time and over battles, you discover, okay, the TDD on this realm are running lots of panic, so we really need to do X to try to deal with that. We need to bolster our resistance to it so that we're not constantly being penalized by them just running all these panic builds.
You mentioned the rock, paper, scissors thing, and I don't think that when they say that, they talk about class rock, paper, scissors synergy. They're talking, I think, more about realm rock, paper, scissors, where the TDD might be better against Vikings better against Arthurians better against TDD, or whatever the circle is. I think that's what they're talking about more so.
I think it's a mix.
Yeah, I think it's a mix of both.
Because I think you definitely wouldn't want Arthurians to always lose against Vikings. That would be ridiculous. Right. We'd never play the game. So I think it's a mix of both. Like, Vikings, depending on what they're doing, are probably going to have some advantages against certain other realms. But even within that, on a micro level, some classes I think will have some decided advantages against other classes, but never enough that I think the goal at least should be that there's never enough that can't be overcompensated by effective builds and player skill. An archer may be good against a mage by default, but I would still like the mage, if played well, to be capable of defeating the archer, instead of just always being like, it's an archer, crap my pants, run. I don't want that response. That's not fun.
I think the rock, paper, scissors thing is just a loose term to describe the idea that one class is good against another, but weak against a different one altogether.
Mm-hmm. Just that it's harder to beat it.
Each example.
When I think they use that in one of the developer newsletters that we read before this, they mentioned that what they're really talking about is advantages and disadvantages, not necessarily that X class always defeats Y class, but in certain matchups, one realm may have some distinct advantages over another realm. One class may have some distinct advantages or disadvantages against another class. And those don't necessarily mean you're going to lose. It just means it's going to be more of a challenging fight for you.
Yeah.
At least I think that's the goal.
I don't think respecs will be in. I think changing your, because it's a horizontal progression of time, your respecs, with the exception of maybe your banes and boons, are your, okay, I don't like this spell really, I'm just gonna learn a new spell and build that up
and
over
use
time.
this one. Yeah.
And
We heard about the I'm not 100% sure if they actually confirmed it fully, but the skill decay, that if you don't use a skill, it's gonna decay as you use another one. But it's a way of respecking.
Well, and I think something that's important to note here. I'm actually, when it comes to new characters, I'm actually more concerned about gear than about ability development, because the game is designed to be horizontal. It's designed to have a more horizontal progression system. So theoretically, a new character coming out shouldn't be at that much of a disadvantage. At least that's the stated intention. Shouldn't be at that much of a disadvantage compared to someone who's been playing for 6 months.
Yeah.
I think the point where that becomes potentially an issue is with gear, which is actually pretty able to be dealt with an established player. Because if you've been playing for 6 months and you know you want a stealther, except for having to buff up your stats, you can actually give yourself some pretty good starter gear, because you should have the money to buy that stuff.
Or crafter friends,
or a crafter friend who go, hey,
yeah.
make me my new stealther some gear, the best I can equip right now, and that should help to equalize things a little bit with a new character.
Strike, it's not a realm being worse against another realm just because. It's the way the realms are designed behind the idea that we talked about it in another vodcast. The fact that the TDD are more guerrilla style oriented makes them makes fighting Arthurians, which are more defense oriented, so harder to fight in that guerrilla style, makes it more challenging. That's the only thing we said. It's not saying that you're a TDD, you're going to be automatically at a disadvantage against that realm or that realm. It's just a philosophy behind it.
It's circumstantial.
The idea
every realm is going to have certain circumstances where they are stronger. Arthurians defending a keep are going to be tough. Looking at the classes, that is pretty blatant. They've got the highest defenses. They've got the longest range. If you're attacking a castle that the Arthurians are ready and raring to go, you're going to have a bad day. Or you're going to struggle through and you're going to have a really good day. The point is, it's not going to be an easy fight, whereas the TDD don't have nearly as many of those blatant defensive bonuses and strategies. So if they're defending a keep, how you're going to go about it, first of all, is going to be very different. How they defend the keep is going to be very different. They're probably less likely, and we actually have a whole video talking about this, but they're actually less likely, I think, to stay behind the walls and just wait, whereas the Arthurians are happy to just sit behind the walls and go, no, bring it to Helm's Deep, we're not moving. Whereas the TDD probably want to fight you out in the field some to try to slow you down and weaken you, because they're good at that hit and run stuff. They're good at being mobile. They're good at slowing you down and tearing you down over time with some of the, at least that's how some of the abilities look. So it really doesn't make sense for them to just sit in the keep and wait. Whereas the Arthurians have no incentive to meet you out in the field whatsoever.
I'm trying to catch up with the chat a bit.
So I agree. Every realm should be equally good, but they're all going to have different ways that they're good.
Yeah.
They're not all going to be good at the exact same things. There was something I wanted to agree with. Oh yeah, Salty Chew mentioned that they did say, and I heard this too at some point ages back, that they would possibly offer respecs if they just totally changed a class. You know, if they were like, you know what, mages aren't working, we're totally changing their abilities. Then yes, they'd be like, here, respecs. There you go.
Yeah, and Strike, I agree. It should be that way, and it's probably going to be that way. It's even going to be perhaps more that way, as some versions of an archetype are better in some instances than others. A perfect example is the Winter Shadow Archer versus the Blackguard have two very different archer playstyles, and you'll see them use them in very different situations. They'll be effective better in some and ineffective in some versus each other. So
I think that's really what it comes down to. is figuring out how to adapt the realm abilities to certain scenarios, and in some cases that's going to be tough. The Arthurians are easy to figure out for a keep, but when you mix the Arthurians out onto a field in the middle of a fight, it's like, okay, well, what do they want to do if they're going up against like the TDD, who have a few more mobility abilities than they do? How are they going to adapt to that? That may be challenging. What classes you bring may impact that. They may go, okay, well, let's roll out more shapeshifters so that we can kind of help to fight that. We know we're going to be fighting TDD today. Let's pull out some of our faster classes and roll those out. I also think that's a thing with progression and class balance and them introducing new classes later. I don't think there's going to be a lot of people that only play one class in this game. I tend to try to make myself, because I have an altaholic tendency and I want to make tons of characters. So I try to be like, no, just play the one class. Stop leveling other stuff. But I think everybody's going to have like a backup character, because some days you go out and you're like, okay, I normally play an archer, but we're defending this keep against X guild, and I know that they use this class a lot. My archer's not very effective against them.
Yeah.
We're probably going to end up fighting them today, so maybe I want to have another character I can whip out. That's the only way you can really counter on a micro level different groups in a short time frame, is if you have other options of characters you can.
Yeah, as Zeromus said, the rock paper scissors thing is Arthurians will want to defend inside the keep. The Vikings will meet you on the field in front of the keep, while the TDD is gonna wear you down before you even reach it. They're not in absolute better than the others. They just need to adapt their fighting style to their strengths. That's it.
It doesn't mean they can't defend from inside the keep or from wherever. It's just that's not necessarily I think it's more a matter of ease. That's not necessarily the easiest thing for them to do. The TVD are going to have challenges if they decide to just wait in the keep. I think, depending on what classes they bring. Maybe they know, there's no way we can counter this group in time out in the field, so we whip out a bunch of Fianna when we normally might not have all those Fianna. I don't know. It's entirely possible.
Yes, Sacric. Skills will always trump the alternative.
That's my preference as well. And this is coming from somebody who honestly is not an amazing MMO PvPer. I think I'm decent. I'm not amazing. I have no herald or list of trophies from different duels and other sorts of things I've done. But I would very much prefer that if someone kills me, I can say it's because they're a better player than me, or they just got lucky. But if they kill me consistently, I can go, all right, Sacrix is better than me. I'm not going to kill him because he's going to kill me consistently, like 90% of the time. And that's just how it is. And I go, okay, I need my healer to heal me. So when I punch him in the face,
as long as you know,
I don't want to do that by myself. I need a friend.
As long as you know your class synergies with your teammates, as well as the weaknesses of who you're fighting, you stand a good chance to see the other day.
Yeah, the main issue I have is gear, and that's where my perspective on that comes from. Is I absolutely hate games where your gear makes or breaks you in PvP. It drives me nuts. That's why I don't do PvP in WoW. I stopped doing that when I was playing in there, because the same thing with Star Wars: The Old Republic. I PvP'd for a little while, but eventually I just couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't really enjoy it, because I was always like, well, if my gear is better than them, I pretty much win. Unless we're certain class combinations, in which case I either stomp them or they absolutely wreck me and there's no way I can win.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, it's just, skill was never up there as a very high consideration for me. For some matchups it was, but generally, but then gear always trumped it. If your gear was not even remotely close, it's not happening. You're just dead.
That's one thing, at least. That's what they say is going to happen, and I suspect with the player crafted gear, that's what's going to happen, is that your gear is not going to make or break your ability to fight and to stand a chance. So
I don't mind somebody having better gear having a slight advantage over me. I'm cool with that, as long as
otherwise you just fight naked. if gear doesn't have any impact at all, just fight in your normal clothes and don't wear any armor. But the gear having an impact, and the gear being the end all be all of your survivability in PvP, is a completely different thing.
And it's also one of the things I like about this game is, again, it's not about 1v1. It's about group v group. I am not an amazing 1v1 duelist. I prefer to play with my group and go, okay, what do we need in the group? We need a support. I'm going to go play a support then, and I'll do whatever the group needs. I think that's going to be a lot more important in this game than any individual person's armor or even an individual person's skill level. I think is the group collective skill level is going to be important. And at least I hope that's the case.
Yeah.
Sacrix asked, do you think all or most classes being in is worth sacrificing something currently in development or planned on the table for development before launch or till after launch?
We discussed that.
You already know what Kriss is going to say.
Yeah.
I would say I actually agree. If for instance, your example earlier, if it were feasible that they could say, you know what, we're going to put depths in the game after launch, and we're going to get in like 3 new classes, I would make that trade. I mean, it depends on the scope. I mean, if we're talking about 1 new class, maybe, I don't know. I'd have to discuss that, consider that. But I would say, sure, 3 new classes, no depths. I think that's a pretty good trade-off. But again, those may not be the same developers. I mean, the people who go into developing classes, I imagine, are probably very different from the people in the resource that go into developing something like the depths.
Well, they only really have the one, so
yeah.
Well, that's what I'm saying, because that's the theory, is if you cancel something like the depths, you're saying I'm redirecting these resources to work on classes.
Yeah.
So are they even capable of really doing that effectively? Because otherwise it's a moot point.
Yeah, and
like the problem for stealthers, which Sacrix hinted at earlier, is that I don't think they plan on having the veil in the game at launch, which is why stealthers aren't in, because they need the veil. They chose to withhold the stealthers because there's another system that they hadn't touched or aren't planning on touching.
I mean, because honestly, the depths is something that I could see as an expansion material. I mean, it's a whole new area with potentially better materials for crafting gear and stuff. It sounds like an expansion.
And let's be honest, they have said nothing about the depths.
Yeah.
Have they even started developing it?
Probably not. No reason to right now. I mean, they have much more pressing concerns, like classes. So, like I said, on those terms, I can agree, but for me, it seems like if they could easily do that, they probably would have considered it because of how late the game is. If they could consider going, hey guys, what would you think about no depths, but we get in stealthers and scouts? You know, there probably would be a lot of stealth people that would go, yes!
Yeah, definitely.
But again, I just imagine those are probably, depths probably requires a lot of programmers, whereas class building, I'm assuming, requires a lot of gameplay developers focusing on the class abilities and the balance of everything and how those work together. I don't know that those are necessarily the same people.
Yeah.
And they're hiring now, so maybe they could hire some for one and not the other. I don't know that. I don't know.
I think largely depths game design, not implementation, but game design is Ben and Mark.
Yeah.
Once Mark becomes more free, class game design is, again, I think just Ben and Mark until
at the moment,
Mark becomes free. Implementation of them is a different team. That's coding. Alongside Ben going in using software tools that we talked about last week or the last episode to add the things he wants into it. So
because with the depths, you're talking not only a totally different type of physical area, you're also talking about an area that changes and shifts around. You're talking about programming the cameras and the traps and things that fit into there, the monster spawns and the NPCs that are supposed to be in there. It just sounds to me like a whole lot of programming that is not necessarily going to be the exact same, I assume, as character design type work. But again, I don't know.
We'll see.
I know we're not going to have naval combat.
Nope.
I would definitely say cut naval combat if that was the conversation.
Yeah.
At any rate, at this point, we're kind of just rambling. So we'll go ahead and wrap things up for the recording. I have new improved internet, but I still don't want to have to upload a 2.5-hour video. So we want to thank everybody for coming and hanging out with us. Everyone that's watching this on YouTube, thanks for sitting through the whole conversation, hopefully. And liking, subscribing, and doing all that kind of stuff on YouTube. Leave some comments. Otherwise, catch you in 2 weeks. I don't remember what we're discussing, but
it might be a beta date.
Yeah, that won't be the whole episode, though.
No.
Till then.